Our world is rapidly changing. And as product practitioners, we are often at the forefront of developing and deploying new products and services. This unique opportunity comes with a critical responsibility. We need to ensure that what we build is both ethical and also beneficial to society. Just because we can build something doesn't mean that we should build it. Now, in a world with AI and technology, the ethical questions are becoming more complex and numerous. I am joined by SVPG partner Jon Moore to discuss how we navigate innovation and ethics in product management. We discuss practical strategies for making ethical decisions and what steps to take if you're tasked with creating a product that does not align with your values. Jon, it is absolutely wonderful to have you on Product Therapy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Christian. Absolutely delighted to be here. In fact, someone said to me 3 days ago, when are you going to be on the podcast, Jon? And I said, in a couple of days. So, yeah.
I love it. Well, I'm glad to have you here. And we are jumping in on a very deep topic with ethics. And thank you for joining me on this. When we talk about risk at SVPG, we've always talked about value risk. We've talked about usability risk. We've talked about feasibility risk. And I have been one of those people early in my career. I just always assumed people don't do stuff that people shouldn't do it. And we don't need to call out ethics as another risk. It's kind of assumed in our world that we are making good choices with what we do. But we've seen over time constant patterns of companies really ignoring the ethical question or not understanding the implications of what their work can be on the environment or the ecosystem. So I'm just gonna jump in. Maybe give me your sense of the role of ethics in the work we do with technology development.
It's a very hot topic, and it's a very complex topic, I think. It's worth pointing out, and you've said some of this already, that there is a big overlap and always has been an overlap here with the viability risk, right? We have long needed to ensure that our products meet the regulation or the constraints that we're operating within. We needed to, and we still need to worry about things like privacy. The accessibility laws and regulations have long been pretty strict in Europe. And I think that's true, across the world too. So this has long been a part of our world. It's also, I think, at least for me, worthwhile backing up, because when I was growing up, I was kind of a child of the crazy ones generation. You remember, the crazy ones ad, the Apple
Yes.
ad? And I remember that, and that had such an impact on me. I was 24 when that was released. It was it 97? I think it was 97.
Wow.
That feels late to me,
Yes.
but that ad for me represented what, technology was all about. And it was a very, I was going to say American, but I think it was a very Californian, influence coming out, which was, we are here to better the world. We have a duty of care to our communities and our societies. And that's what Apple stood for. And it really raised and highlighted those amazing individuals, Charlie Chaplin and all those amazing, folks in that ad. So, here we are today reflecting on that and thinking, well, how have we done? It's a mixed bag, right? It's a mixed bag. And the interesting thing, and why it's so complex, I think if we stopped 100 people or spoke to 100 product managers and engineers, I would be incredibly surprised if we thought any one of those was unethical, right? So it's not that we are deeply unethical or there's some malice, but clearly something is going wrong. Whether that's companies not highlighting the risk or culturally not addressing the risks, or whether it's way more complex than that. This kind of issue of unintended consequence is very hard for us to deal with. We can deal with the knowns and we can deal with some of the unknowns. The real issue is the unknown unknowns. And that's a tricky one to deal with for sure. But we do need to do a better job.
You call out a great point. I think many people see the ethical question as some big event. There is some clear scenario where you're saying, is this right or is this wrong? But at the end of the day, it probably feels like a series of small decisions made over time. It's almost one of those things like it comes out not as some big episode. And I was listening to Radhika Dutt talking about, she's writing a book on radical ethics. And she was saying we have this ethical heroism where, we're like all ethical heroes in waiting, expecting some big atrocity or question that is clear to us. Oh, this is an opportunity to say, no, this is not right. But the reality is the accumulation of all these small decisions that may feel inconsequential at the time in which you're making it. But, this idea that It's a constant thing in our world. Now, one of the things I think begs to question in this dynamic is who owns the ethical question in a company? I think the first time I saw a chief ethics officer was like Rob Chestnut when he was at Airbnb, and just a phenomenal role to have at that point. But it's not like we see chief ethical officers every day or the ethics department. We see regulatory compliance people that probably exist to keep the laws of a government or a regulatory body in place, but we don't see this very clear ownership of ethics. And I've always argued, product managers are on the front line, so we should care. But what's your thoughts on who owns the ethical question?
The most obvious way of answering it is we all own it, but we know how that turns out, right? If everyone owns it, no one owns it. The real answer for me is it's a little like the conversations we have on transformation. If the leaders and the executive leaders aren't front and center, truly representing ethics, then I would say, well, why should anyone else care, right? So we need our leaders to be front and center to ensure that we have, that word again, that phrase, psychological safety. It's another one where I think it's absolutely critical to this debate, because if there isn't psychological safety, it's going to be very hard for folks to say, well, you know what, Mr. or Mrs. Chief Executive, I'm not even sure we should do this, right? That takes a heck of a lot of bravery if there isn't some safety. So I would argue the first thing is the culture needs to be set. And that is going to be set by the executive, not just the executives, but absolutely the managers. And, back to how we think about product leadership, the managers have got to be there asking the question, ensuring that the teams are able to ask that question, ensuring that the teams are asking that question, and ensuring that it's a two-way street. And then, of course, reciprocating and ensuring they are absolutely willing to hear the moment when the teams say, well, Jon, I don't know about this one because, we played some war games or whatever, it was, and we ran through these scenarios and we think there's some potential of misuse here that could be pretty worrying. So, hey, I would like to get your take on that. That is a real valid question. Now, I think your question was, who should really own it at team level, the PM, the engineer? I don't really know the answer, but I suspect it's more likely to be the PM. Now, What I don't want anyone to hear is, well, I'm an engineer and designer, so I don't have to care about this stuff. I mean, I truly believe that everyone will own it. But I think we do have to call it out whose responsibility it is to own it and ensure these questions are asked, right? And for me, that is probably going to be the PM if you made me say, well, just choose someone, Jon, because we have to have someone on the hook for it.
It's kind of a battlefront ownership, whoever is at the forefront of it. And you make a great point that a company cares about what the leaders care about at the end of the day. And if you're not having ethical conversations in a company, if the culture doesn't care about ethics, if you see decisions from leadership that don't reflect ethical decisions, then you're kind of sending a message in the environment that that's what we do here. And I've always argued that the PM should take on a lot of, because we've played on it, the viability question, but the idea that they will see something mostly before it goes out. They will see a design, they will see whether they are doing an acceptance test, whether they are doing a demo or prototype. I mean, they are at the forefront of this. And in some ways, they are the ones, when people talk about being the CEO of the product, in some ways, they are the ones truly empowered to speak up on behalf of the team to stakeholders, to leadership on that question of like, should we do this or is this wrong? And, one of the things, Jon, is actually knowing what that question is and when to say that question. Maybe how do you say it? If I see something that doesn't feel right, if I see something that I think will hurt our customers, will hurt the ecosystem, will hurt the environment, will have a long-term impact on choices we might make we're using metadata in some ways that might hamper free speech or true democracy or hurt us in the future. Maybe tell me how in the world I escalate this. Do I just take it out of the product? Are there some words that I should say? And what do I do if I am falling on deaf ears?
Let me bring it to life. So I'm purposefully not going to give too much detail. Let's assume that there was a role that I was in where I was running a pretty big, communications service. And let's assume that strategically the board had decided we're going to launch in China. Now, when you're in that position, there are things that you need to do and regulations that you need to plug into that will essentially allow you or not to launch your service in China. And there are implications, to those decisions, which folks may or may not, agree with. So I found myself in this position, in exactly that position where the board had made the decision we're going to do this, in full knowledge, of course, what the product team is going to have to do. And I remember to this day sitting there with Jira open, writing the ticket, thinking, I don't know how I feel about this, right? And I knew for sure that some of the engineers who hadn't yet seen what I'd been party to as a senior product leader. And so when I introduced it to the team, I said, look, I know what I'm going to say next is not going to be greeted, with smiles from many of you. It is perfectly legitimate if you say, I do not want to work on this ticket. I do not want to work on this solution. And that is going to be okay with me. And that was part of the psychological safety, right? And I think I didn't know how to handle it, in truth, because I was really making this up, right? But I did know that it was a good team. And I did know that I wanted to provide that safety for the engineers. And sure enough, I think I'm right in saying that a few of them just said, okay, we get it, but I don't want to, take part in that. And some others said, well, I'm okay with that. If the board are okay with that, if the executives are okay with that. I still to this day, I don't exactly know how I feel about it. I followed through. I did, raise it with my boss, and we talked about it. We had a very, good conversation about it. And I decided that I was going to jump on board, and I was going to play a part in that. And so I did. But, it is still one of those moments where I still wonder, well, I don't know, should I? Or maybe I do think that had I said to my boss, who I would have walked over coals for, he was amazing. He almost certainly would have said, that is okay, Jon. I totally respect your decision.
You're talking about this, and I'm almost seeing the biggest risk, or the real fifth risk, is actually psychological safety. It's probably like the biggest risk of all of this is, to the extent that you have smart, talented people on a product team that care and understand your business and your customers, if they can speak up, there's some sense that they will know. And the real risk is that they didn't speak up. I was reading a study years ago when I was kind of slamming meetings. There was this article that came out, just like why great companies build bad products. And I thought it would be some magical insights around discovery or something. They didn't do enough research or something. And it was just like a bad meeting. And they went case after case of showing somebody in a company, when you read those scandals or things that come out, there's always somebody who was like, I knew this was terrible, I kind of think, and you have this culture of people not speaking up. Like there was always someone that knew something was a bad decision or something would not work well or had some insight or data. And as you're kind of describing that story, and I said, boy, first of all, you go into your engineers and being vulnerable about like, look, I may not agree with this, and I want you all to let's talk about it, and hearing their opinions, then you being able to talk to leadership about it on their behalf. And I love disagree and commit environments where people can be like, yeah, but I understand it. We've weighed the risk. We are accepting the risk. We understand that. I might not agree with it fully, but I can see that it's not going to be, or we have ways to challenge that. The real hard part of product work, I've always argued, is we got to do things that delight our customers and also work for our business. And I've always thought the second part of making things work for your business is the challenge. I've always said it's easy to delight customers. We can do things that make us fall in love with the brand. But will we be profitable? Will we have revenue? Will we grow? Will we get what we want in return? But then the ethical question often comes when we shift or kind of over-index on like, this is going to make us money, or, this is going to help us grow. And we don't think about the customer or the impact. And more I see this, Jon, and maybe you have too, I have seen more B2B companies struggle with this than direct to consumers. And it's often because the product people don't care about the customers as much, Maybe give me your sense. It's almost like the more you connect with a customer, the more you understand the people you're serving, the easier it is for you to think about the impact of your work to them.
I think there are two ways of thinking about it. I love the way that you talk there about we have to produce solutions that work for our customers and work for our business. And you could add the kind of third dimension and work for wider, society, right? Which, wow.
Yes.
This is hard, right? However, I don't even know whether we need that. And here's my pitch. My pitch is that we know what happens when we fail the ethical test, right? We know, and I don't know whether, if you're listening to this in the States, maybe you're not staying across what's happening in Europe, but there is a wave of regulation that is now, at the very least, going to hit the social media companies. We're at the very start of that. It's a ripple right now, but it's coming. And, the most egregious arguments today are we're not even going to let kids have a smartphone until they're 18. And there are a lot of people that agree with that in Europe. And there may be a lot of people that agree with that in the States. I don't know. So my point being that, if we get some of these wrong, then the impact on our business is significant. So
yes.
Getting the ethical question right is good for business. That's the kind of, that's what I want people to hear. And actually, getting the ethical question wrong can be very, very bad for business. If we can frame it using that, then we don't need this third kind of ethical dimension. But I don't know whether I'm right, but I think there are enough stories which tell us that if we get the ethical stuff wrong, that it turns out that's not so good for anyone.
Oh boy, I love that. I wish we could. It's kind of like it's an impact thing, and I'm saying that because as you're describing this, I think most of those unethical decisions are short-term thinking rather than long-term impact, because many people have gotten away with a whole lot until the regulators step in, until these compliance things step in, until there are laws that prohibit kids from having phones. We are going to milk as much of their data and take as much of their time. And so, there is a cultural aspect of how much are people thinking about outcomes? People thinking about, is there a contractual obligation to society? Are people saying to themselves like, how would this be good for society in the long term? Would this create a more harmonious working in the environment? And I was recently in Africa talking with a fintech, and one of the things they don't have in many environments there is like a credit system or a way to lend money out, and if you don't repay it, it will affect your credit rating or some level of trust with you. And what they do is they shame people, so if you ask to lend money, they will download all of your contacts. And if John doesn't repay back, they will send a text message to everybody in your contacts and be like, John is a terrible person. He owes money. He's bad, and they can argue like it's the only leverage they have about getting people to do it. But I'm looking at a customer and talking about like the stress and the impact in their work and in just their mental health stress of people that did not read the fine print when they gave you access to their phone just because they wanted to get money in an instant. And they're telling me, well, it's hard. What other things do we have to do? And, my first response was, this is literally why we have the product discipline. It is the very existence. This is the description of a hard problem. That's the easy solution. Like, that's not the right one. You just gave up what was right for what was easy. You're describing what people, this a downterm impact of unethical decisions. On the other hand, I am even making an argument like this is what product work is. I don't even know how else to stress that if in some ways you don't recognize that part of what makes the job difficult is you're constantly trying to solve a problem in a way that, like you said, works for society, works for our business, works for our customers. But it's not always about doing the easy thing. It's about doing the right thing. Okay, I want to make sure I bring up these aspects of AI in our work and generative AI and what we've seen. And I kind of want to just tee up that conversation. Maybe give me your take on how AI might affect ethics, the use of AI, the implication in product work, particularly around this conversation of should we do it?
I should set up my stall. I'm a believer that technology is a force for good. I have to justify that argument more and more with some people these days, but I still fundamentally believe that. We also live in an environment where we have signed up to kind of test and learn, right? And we're seeing the implications of that every day. Now, if we are going to accept that, and again, I think there would be many good arguments why technology has failed in that respect, and I would have to accept some of those. If we are going to live in a world where we are releasing these new technologies on society with the confidence and belief we can fix them as we go, then we had better be sure that we do fundamentally fix these issues. We've just lived through, a decade or two of social media, and some would argue, has that left us in a better place? Many would say no, and I'm enormously sympathetic to those viewpoints, I have to say. So we cannot do the same with AI. And of course, we only have to spend 3 minutes looking online at some of the crazy things we're seeing, whether it's Bard or any of the technologies today, just to see the rubbish, the ridiculous, and slightly concerning, if not outrightly concerning, stuff we are getting served up. So this is a long-winded way of saying we have to ensure that we respond quickly, right? Yeah. Back to my unintended consequences point, if that is going to be the system that we use to improve our product, then we have to follow through. I would argue that, maybe we have not been as quick to deal with some of this with our previous technologies. And I don't think we can afford to make that same mistake today with AI, because it is more complex. I think the risks are potentially higher. And, back to the point about some of this stuff being bad for business. If we get this stuff wrong, there is going to be lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, whether it's about copyright or some other form of infringement that is going to afflict these companies and tie them up for the next 20 years in legal cases. So, we are going to have to really, I think, ensure that we are launching product in a more sensitive way, and then also reacting way faster than we have in the past.
Whose responsibility in this dynamic do you think it is to not regulate the use of AI, but the application in an environment? Like, if a team is leveraging generative AI in their work, is it the ethical responsibility of those creating the large language models? Is it the responsibility of how we apply it? How upstream or downstream should we be pushing this ethical question, or is it everywhere?
Well, the only right answer is, in a world of supreme complexity where, frankly, some of these companies, there will be a small number, if that, of individuals that even understand, what is going on in the center of some of these algorithms, right? The responsibility has to be everyone's, and I think it has to be driven through a set of principles that we all sign up to. And I do think there is a case for regulation. I think some of the social media companies are probably even today saying, well, you know what, we've tried and failed. And I think most are expecting regulation to come in. So, forms of regulation don't have to necessarily be a bad thing. There is a reason why I can safely turn on my television at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and know that it is going to be something that my child can watch, or it isn't some form of pornography or hardcore violence. Regulation has solved some of these problems before. We've solved, the social media problem, before. We have a different name for it. It's called telly,
Yes.
or television, right? So some of this stuff isn't new. And so we can apply that. And we can apply our knowledge. The great challenge, of course, is that regulation moves very slowly.
Yeah, you kind of bring up a good point. I think there's a learning aspect to this too as well, because you're actually calling out what was ethical in the 70s may not be ethical today. In some ways, what we saw on telly as kids, or the movies we watched, or some of the misogyny and the words and the language. And, one of the coaching I give to teams is you've got to read more than product books. In some ways, you've got to be very aware of the dynamics in the world. And so you actually making that statement, if I were coaching someone on ethics, there's some important point about we sometimes need to unlearn some things. And there is some social awareness aspect to what is ethical or appropriate today. And you can imagine generationally, if our parents were building products, what they thought was ethical will be very different from how we're building products. And so it brings an interesting question of who is building for our kids? Who is thinking, if we are a generation building products today, are we thinking in some ways about what's best for them and what works for them? And Jon, I cannot help but try to push on who is really owning that thinking.
Well, look, I know you agree, 1,000% with what I'm going to say next, but one of the major deltas in these environments that you've just described, like our parents producing products versus us and what we know today, is this lack of diversity, is a lack of, different opinions in the room saying, you know what, I don't think that's appropriate, or that offends me, and my background, because my background is not your background. We didn't have that then. That was the issue, is that everyone was white, everyone was a man in the room or whatever, and everyone was from the West, and no one was sharing, well, that feels a little offensive, right? No one talked about that because they, even if they knew, they weren't speaking up. So when we think about ethics, a part of this starts with hiring. When we talk about the cultural influence series, we absolutely, as leaders, and I know this is maybe off topic and more into product leadership, but it is yet another good reason why we absolutely must commit to ensuring we have diversity at a leadership level, at team level. You and I talk a lot about the fact that is good for business too, right? I mean, there is empirical evidence which we cite, which states time and time again that the more diverse the team in terms of gender and backgrounds and race, then the better the revenues. Well, I would argue the case that we are almost certainly likely to get a better ethical result too.
Oh boy, yeah, that's just gold. Because you're calling out some dynamics that are actually deeper in this ethical conversation. One is, I'm alluding to the fact, like I will say, like, boy, if we don't have psychological safety, it doesn't even matter how, well thought out, well thought through any of those things are. In some ways, it still will fall flat in a company. And two, in some ways, you're calling out the important downstream impacts of diversity in our hiring, in the room, in the thoughts we make. If everybody thinks the same, then we're probably going to have solutions that may not work for people that don't think the same or look the same or feel or see the world in the same way. And those two things I think are important to take out of this conversation today, is the need to start your ethical conversations as early as, do we have diverse thoughts, opinions, backgrounds in the room, in the decisions that we make? And do we have a safe enough environment for people to speak up? This is magical. Jon, I cannot stress enough about how magical this episode has been for me to have this conversation on ethics. I want to make sure people really understand fundamentally, as we wrap up here, what it feels like. I tell people, if it goes against your integrity or your values, that's kind of the feeling that you want to hold up front. But you're really asking yourself, how is this good for our customer? How is this good for our customer's customer? How is this good for society? Is there an impact on the environment? Are there third parties in this community that I'm not thinking about? I think Rob Chestnut always says, if the government knew everything, will there be a problem in how it was made? Or, if all the emails and discussions about how this was made became public, will you feel embarrassed? And more importantly, do you have a sense of pride around the work as part of your personal brand? Can you stand behind it? And I want people to kind of understand that those are the things that borderline on that ethical conversation that are prompts to you for what you need to escalate to people. Jon, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for the gift of your time today. What a phenomenal time with you. I look forward to recording another episode with you very soon.
Thanks, Christian.
Want to learn more? Until next time, please check out svpg.com. Sign up for our newsletter that Maddie Kagan puts out. Join us for one of our workshops near you and get access to all of the articles and content we put out. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Until next time, have a good day.
A quick disclaimer: while this podcast is named Product Therapy, it is not hosted by licensed therapists or mental health professionals, and it is in no way a substitute for professional mental health services. We recognize the importance of mental well-being and encourage anyone facing personal difficulties to seek support from qualified professionals. See www.findahelpline.com